Welcome, good evening, and welcome to the third and final program of Residences at Vantage Point's Arts and Culture Collective's Community Rising, an online series of film and discussion evenings in celebration of Residences at Vantage Point's 30th anniversary. My name's Patty Hutton. I'm the marketing director for Vantage Point, and we have been proud to be part of the fabric of Columbia's town center for 30 years. We are a not-for-profit continuing care retirement community overseen by an all-volunteer board of directors made up of local leaders. We offer older adults the opportunity for maintenance-free, active lifestyle right here in Columbia, with the added peace of mind knowing they don't have to change their address should additional support of assisted living, memory care, or comprehensive nursing care ever be needed in the future. We are very excited to offer this series for residents, members of our signature club, and those in the greater community. These are very important topics of discussion, and we're so glad we have had the opportunity to bring on these wonderful leaders in our community. Previous two programs, Political Progress of Women and Anti-Racism and Black Lives Matter, were very engaging and inspiring, as I expect this evening's program to be. Tonight's program is focused on what it takes to be racially literate. We'll start with a TED Talk by the two college-age authors of the textbook, Tell Me Who You Are. Afterwards, we'll see and hear a conversation between Sabina Taj, member of the Howard County Board of Education, and Uma Ribeiro, a Hammond High School junior. And we'll start here with the TED Talk. Excellent. That was really wonderful and amazing young women to be doing what they've been doing and to move this country forward. Now I'd like to welcome Sabina Taj and Uma Ribeiro. We've asked them to join us to reflect upon the issue of what it means to be racially literate. If the audience members have questions you'd like to ask our panelists, you can type them into the chat feature, and I'll be sure to make sure they have the ability to get into the conversation. So Uma, Sabina, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having us.
Yes, thank you so much for having us. Uma, do you want to start?
Yes, so I love that video. I've watched it a few times now, and I really like how they break things up into, a heart gap and like a mind gap. And for me, when I think of the heart, I do think of storytelling, as they brought up. And, storytelling can just be like one of the first steps to racial literacy, as they brought up, because, listening to stories told by people of color, or narratives told by people of color about people of color, can really just, broaden horizons and can lead to greater empathy. And then, like, even on the behalf of those telling the stories, it can allow for one to really figure out their own identity by telling these stories. So even like the cultural identity brought up, that point of, there's differences in cultures, and we can kind of avoid cultural insensitivity through storytelling. If we have these narratives that so many people are reading, so many people are listening to, and we can, even myself growing up, I have like little habits from my own family, and often I was told by my white friends, why are you doing that? Why are you doing it this way? And to me, I heard it like, why aren't you doing things the way I'm doing things? So there's this urge, there's this desire upon hearing that to assimilate, to think, oh, white equals American, and I should be doing these little habits that I've been raised doing. So we can avoid that cultural insensitivity and that racial insensitivity by telling our stories. So that's what I took away from the heart gap.
Yeah, I love that. I think it was, for me, it was a similar reaction, Uma. Is just, how can you know someone without hearing their story, without stepping into their experience? And that statistics are also so important because they inform how the structure of our society works. But unless you connect it to, okay, this many men are incarcerated, but unless, what does that mean? What does that mean to that family? What does that mean to that man? How does that impact? And how, with my no experience of that, how do I understand how to function in that space? How do I, for systemically being, and I'm not speaking as a government official, I'm actually speaking as an individual today, but how will that inform, if I am a government official, how does that inform how I make policy and how I write legislation and how I advocate if I don't step into that personal space and understand that story and hear that story, and ideally, that I experience that story. Hopefully we are electing representative leadership so that we are coming from that personal experience. But until we can get to that space, we say with teachers, we know that 80%, 84% of teachers are white. So we're not going to make that shift. We're trying to, have more representation in the teaching force. But until we get there, that storytelling, that stepping into that experience is so powerful. And I love that Cherokee saying, I don't tell me who you are, you tell me who you are. I think that to me, that just resonated so much, because I think I see the world in that way. I'm not telling you what your identity is. You have to inform me of that in your experience. Right. But Uma, you and I spoke earlier, and one of the most amazing, because I have multiple identities, and I'll go into that after you go, because I think yours is so much more interesting. But you have two identities within yourself, and I want to touch on that after you speak about it. But will you tell folks in the room, just and someone asked actually, let's see, can Uma? It was Farida Guzdar asked, can Uma and Sabina tell us a little about their racial background and family heritage? So why don't you start, and then I'll chime in.
Yes, definitely. So my father is from Goiânia, Brazil. So it's a little city in Brazil. And he was born there, so he's an immigrant. My mom was born in New York City, but her family is from Bombay in India. So I'm half first generation, half second generation. So I have this experience of, I have my mom who's grown up in this country, so I have that, and I can relate to her in many aspects. And then I have, this whole other side, which is, learning about my dad growing up. So it's very interesting to have these two perspectives. And, because of my appearance specifically, I was talking to Sabina about this earlier, I get grouped in with Latina because, my, like I said, my dad is Brazilian, so I'm part Latina. And due to, my looks, that's what people associate me with. So it's been very interesting to try and explain my identity to people, because it's much easier to, as a mixed person, as a mixed kid, it's so much easier to just, when you're hanging out with Latinos, to just say I'm Latina, and that's my identity. And it's so easy when I'm with my Indian friends, for instance. Even like last year, one of my close Indian friends invited me to an event, and I just said, oh, I'll go. And I'd never been to an event like that before, but I wanted to be like, no, that's part of me. I should know everything there is to know about this, but I'm mixed. So that's part of my identity. I'm not one full thing, and that's okay.
And do you feel like when people view you, how do they, is there one that's more dominant than the other, for example?
Yes. Honestly, up until recently, I felt as though being Latina was so dominant for me. I look like my father. I'm in love with, the language of Spanish. My father, though we speak Portuguese, he's a Spanish interpreter, so I have that side of me. I was raised in Baltimore City until I was 13, and there's so many Latino communities there. And I would go there and people would just start speaking to me in Spanish. So I always felt more connected to that. And I've been engaging in so many discussions lately, especially, with everything happening under just this administration in the past few years, with everything happening, especially in the Latino community with immigration. I've also felt so strongly about those issues as well. But then I think about growing up, and I think about not only did I have this experience of both my parents, even my mom speaking to me in Portuguese as well, both of my parents speaking to me in Portuguese, and, you know, engaging in all of these Latinx cultural experiences, but also going to the Hindu temple. You know, I was with my grandma on my mom's side so often growing up, and, you know, she's Indian, and I was raised with her, you know, and so I'm also trying to acknowledge that that's part of me, and that I have so much of that in me as well.
That's very cool. And for me, I have also just a multiple array of identities in my family. My father is an Indian Muslim, and my mother, turns out, is a Yemeni Jew. And we didn't know that for the better part of our lives, and just recently found out. I mean, she's full Yemeni Jew. And so I was talking to a rabbi recently, and I said, well, that's interesting, because from your mother's lineage, your children are Jewish. From your father's lineage, because it travels through the father, your children are Muslim. And I thought, oh, it's interesting. So which one do I pick? And we, I actually go to the meeting house, and I'm a Quaker if I had to pick anything. But it's so, you know, I do tend to struggle with my identity. Where am I part Indian? I am part Yemeni, and I also was born in Pakistan. And just here also, I think I identify with if I'm in the culture I'm in and the group that I'm in, I tend to code switch. I don't know if you do that, but
Yes.
I code switch between the people that I'm with. And I think that sometimes it's fun and you're able to do that. And it's like, wow, I can step into so many different experiences. But sometimes it feels like I'm always the other, because
Yes.
I truly no identity. And so sometimes you can feel like, where is my home? And one of the things I do find is I get along really well with people who have multiple identities, because we share that experience. And so I can see where there's comfort in similarities and how that divides us, but also how that can bring us together.
Definitely. Yeah, and I feel so, like, again, you know, so natural talking to you as well. I think that having this perspective can just really help. And it's so interesting that you bring up the point that, you know, it can feel overwhelming at times, because, you know, on the one hand, I'm so, like, appreciative of my cultures, and my identity, and the fact that I've been able to, you know, have all these different perspectives. But then I've also, you know, felt kind of like, oh, well, I need to be all of one thing. And so, yeah, it can definitely be a difficult experience at times.
Yeah, I agree. Okay. So I would love for you to tell a story about something about you that sort of brought you to an understanding of racial literacy, or like when you had that. Was there a moment? Was there an evolution? I know you're a fierce advocate for racial advocacy, racial justice advocacy, and that you that this is something you feel so strongly about, as I do. And we talked a little bit about that that's something close to both our hearts, and a place where we see changing ourselves and the people close to us and rippling out to create a world like these two young women we're talking about. Is we have work to do and we need to get to it. You and I feel that way. But what brought you to this work, and can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, you said the word evolution. For me, I feel like it was a process. It was definitely an evolution. There wasn't like one single moment where I was like, oh, you know, I'm truly understanding my identity now. It's just a culmination of so many things. As for advocacy, I feel like just a few years ago, when I was maybe 13 or so, I felt, you know, that was when this new administration was coming into office. There were so many things happening at once, and I just felt, you know, like it was something I had to do to advocate. As for racial literacy, there were so many different experiences. Growing up, you know, as young as kindergarten, being mixed up with other brown girls, you know, being called their names, you know, people brushing that off, being told, you know, teachers are people that you learn from. You know, you're supposed to admire them, you're supposed to look up to them. And then having, you know, so many, like you said, over 80% of teachers are white, and having teachers mix me up with other people feels as though, you know, do they know me as a person, or are they mixing me up because of my race? It's something that's brushed off so often. Other things, you know, like I've had in middle school specifically, I was both trying to do the India board and the Brazil board for International Night, which was like a program that we had each year where we showcased our culture. And my teacher asked me if I wanted to do both, and I said yes. And then my other teacher said, well, you're not Indian, so why are you doing the India board? And I said, I actually am. I am part Indian. And I explained my whole identity to him. I explained that my mom is Indian, and he told me maybe 5 times that I'm not Indian. It was like he was trying to convince me that I was not. And so that was one experience that I took to heart. And I was like, you know, I don't want others telling me who I am. I don't want other people defining me, and I don't want that to happen to other people as well. So those were some experiences where I knew I had to get into it.
Yeah. Yeah, I certainly like the microaggressions that you're talking about, and just defining, you know, I lived in England, and I knew, you know, I was told that I didn't take showers because I was brown, or I would get pushed in the cloakroom because, you know, for racial reasons. And I remember an art teacher saying, you know, why don't, and I drew myself as white because I was too embarrassed to draw myself as brown. And our teacher said, you know, you should use the color of your skin. And I felt like he cussed at me. Like, why would you say that to me? Like, why would you say? And now I realize that poor art teacher was like, own who you are. But at that time, it was such a powerful thing for me to associate my color with ugliness, or associate my color with being, you know, less than, that it felt like a slap in the face. But I still actually, as an Asian and an Indian, we have a lot of anti-Blackness and you're nodding because you know this part of our culture. There's a lot of racial bias within the culture.
Yes.
Oh, and on that note, and I want you to keep this conversation going, but we do have a question from the audience.
Yeah.
For both of you. What do you think about Kamala Harris being identified as African American when her father was Jamaican and her mother was from India? So do you think that her attending Howard University had any effect or played in connecting her culturally to the African American Blacks, as opposed to her mother's side, the Indian side?
To touch on that, you know, that really does tie into Sabina's point also, just of there is anti-Blackness within, you know, the Indian community. And I've thought about this a lot with Kamala Harris, and spoken to my family about it as well, when they were questioning, you know, why doesn't she identify herself, you know, as her whole self? And I feel like there is just this pressure to be one thing. There's this pressure to be part of one community. There's this, I think there a lot of it ties into just people might not want, you know, a mixed person in office. It might be too much for them. So to just pick one identity. So that's what I kind of associate her identifying herself as that. And as for her going to Howard University, that might play a role, because, like, you know, I even said, you know, if I've been in these communities where I just feel Latina sometimes, and there's that pressure to be like, that's what I want, that's who I am. And so I think, you know, who you're with, you know, your community, your surroundings can really impact that.
I wonder if that's, you know, when there's sort of a famous personality, everybody wants to claim them.
Yeah.
It's part of me. I mean, the reality is she's a beautiful, amazing, accomplished, lovely woman who is both. And she gets to tell me who she is. Mm-hmm. And she has told me she is both. So whatever the media tells me, whatever somebody else tells me, I have to believe who she says she is. Yeah. And to me, that she has demonstrated herself and held herself and communicated that so clearly about her identity, that I think that I turn to her to inform me of who she is. And I think we all should turn to the person and do that. But I think the most powerful thing for me that brought me to this work, Uma, and it was that there are so many inequities in our country.
Yes.
There are the health disparities and the wealth gap and this opportunity gap. And the fact that when I started to look at statistics, and I do tend to function more in the mind kind of space, is unconscionable that we have not addressed these things. That we as a country put our head in the sand and not face what we have created. That we had 400 years of oppressing a people.
Yeah.
And that translates into huge inequities that have never been corrected. And for me, that was, you know, in my culture, like when we moved to this country, they said, move to the whitest neighborhood and the wealthiest neighborhood you can find. So buy the smallest house in that neighborhood. And we believed it, right? Like that was sort of like, okay, oh, all right, that's what you do. And then you slowly start to meet people, and my parents fully bought into that, right?
Yeah.
So you start to meet people and you say, I'm like, Mom, Dad, this is wrong. Like we have been fed bad information. And you start to re-examine things as you meet people, as you look at information, like the heart and the mind. And I think for me, that was sort of why I dove into this work, because I feel like it's unfair. Uma, this question is so exciting for me to ask you. Okay, America is in the streets right now, literally, right? Like in the streets demanding change. And your generation is leading this. Have we seen anything like this before? Even in Howard County, we saw how Hoko for Justice bring together the largest gathering in Howard County. We were just seeing young people do incredible things.
Yeah.
And do you think this is another civil rights movement? Why do you think it's young people, and why do you think it's happening now?
Well, that's a great question, and I think there's so many different factors that play into that. I feel as though, as young people, coming from my own perspective, there's this feeling that we need to. I was just, speaking to a member of one organization in Baltimore that's taking to the streets, and it's this feeling of, people are coming to us and saying, oh, like, we're so excited for you and that you're doing all of this, but it's this deeply rooted, anger. Like, we're fed up. It's not something that we want to have to be doing, but we have to, because this is something that's been going on for hundreds of years, and this needs to stop. And as for if it's another civil rights movement, I don't think the civil rights movement ever stopped. We think about, what I learned in school. I think about my textbooks, and we learn that that civil rights movement was this long, and that it stopped. And it didn't. It's been going on forever now, but now we have these huge social media platforms, so people are taking to that. So we have more activity and more momentum now more than ever. And I also think that, though, we were taking to the streets with so many different things with the climate movement before COVID, I think COVID plays a role in this, because with COVID, number one, there's nowhere to run and hide and distract yourself. We were all at home for a while. There's nothing we can distract ourselves with. We can't ignore everything that's happening. There were, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor. There are Black people who are actively being killed and because of their skin and because of their race, and we couldn't ignore that. It's on the news. We're seeing these videos circulating on social media, and it's just this gut feeling that's like, this is wrong. This has been happening forever, and this is wrong, and we have nowhere to run and hide, and we can't go to school or to work and just keep going, like, being busy and distracting ourselves. And also with COVID, we see that it disproportionately affects Black people and brown people, African Americans and Latinos the most. It affects, us in a different way. And so that also plays a role in just waking up and seeing that this is a whole nother, crisis that's happening, this pandemic, and we're going to be affected. People of color are going to be affected still because of our policies.
And do you think, for me too, I think the COVID really heightened the awareness of the number of BIPOC who were impacted in a disproportionate way, right? We saw that there was nowhere to run from that. There was nowhere to run from looking at those health disparities. There was nowhere to run from looking at schools and people not having access to equal access to education because they didn't have technology, because they didn't have a device, or they didn't have internet access. There was nowhere to run when you're starting to look at how this is impacting who can stay home and protect themselves and who can't stay at home and protect themselves. There was no, when we saw who was in those, we say there are heroes, the medical community. Well, the medical community signs over, they say that, in the beginning, but does a grocery store clerk? Does a driver, does a bus driver, did they make that oath? Are they paid for that kind of, no, they're not heroes, they're hostages.
Yeah.
They're hostages of 400 years. They're hostages of their economic circumstances. They're hostages of their lack of wealth. There's nowhere to look except at those things that are happening. And I think that really has brought this, we said I did this other talk, and it was the pandemics of COVID, racial justice, and economic justice. There were three things that are really coming and intersecting at this point, which I think but I am so proud of our kids. I'm so proud of you and the leadership that you have taken in making change. And I really think student voices and young voices need to be given the power and the elevation that they need to have right now, because you're inheriting this world.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay.
And I really appreciate that. Sorry. I just, from what you were saying, I'm even seeing, these statistics about how in Baltimore City, for instance, they don't have technology, and I'm here in Howard County, and I'm so privileged to have a computer and all of these different things that just still helps me have the ideal education. And I feel like being able to use that privilege, instead of just sitting in your privilege and feeling guilty about having something that others don't, you can use that to help.
Yeah, definitely. So there's somebody said, Uma, you're a beautiful blend of two amazing cultures.
Oh, thank you.
I agree. I wanted you to hear that.
Yes, definitely.
Can you think of an instance of racism, Uma, that you have experienced? I think you can probably think of like hundreds, but
yeah,
that have stayed with you or were more powerful than others, or?
Yeah, I feel like there's microaggressions again, like I brought up earlier. There are little things that build up, but then there are more broad things that are more direct, like somebody assuming that you don't speak English, or just things like that. And even, Sabina and I, we were talking earlier about since I'm so mixed, I have a younger sister. She's only 13 years old. And the racism that we experience is so different. And then yet it's just like she looks more Indian, because, people like to associate how you look with a race, with an ethnicity. And so, she's been associated with Indian her whole life, and I've been associated with Latina. And so, while I have been told, do you speak English, without somebody even knowing me or somebody even hearing me speak. She's been called things like terrorist in her schools. And this just goes to show that we need to start having discussions about racial literacy early on in schools, because we can't expect, kids to be learning about all of this with their parents. We're told in schools that that politics can't enter schools, but it's a point of humanity. And I think that we need, in order to prevent these racist encounters at such a young age, we need to start having these discussions early on. But yeah, that's definitely one instance. Just language is a big thing, being asked if I speak English, things like that.
And being your teacher telling you that you're not Indian.
Yes, or one thing is my teacher telling me I'm not Indian, and like insisting and getting offended that I was trying to defend myself, and just things like that, and just being called Mexican. That when I was growing up, I took pride in that. I loved this community, and I do, but people only associate Latina and Hispanic with Mexican. It's like they're grouping in brown people into one country. So that I believe is more so a microaggression, but it still is an instance of racial insensitivity.
How about when you're in a group of white people or other people? What are some of are there any microaggressions that come to mind that are immediate and that you think of and you're like, oh yeah, that's like daily life?
Yes. I feel like one thing, you know, a close friend of mine who was white, I was once, you know, just as friends do, discussing with her, I was like, you know, sometimes I feel overwhelmed being mixed, you know, sometimes I feel like it's a lot. And she just point blank replied, you know, why are you complaining about being mixed? You should be grateful. You have so much culture in your life and so much, like, aren't you grateful for your culture? Aren't you grateful for that? And that kind of shut me down, and I realized I feel as though I can't talk to my white friends in the same way, because it's this, it's another, in a sense, a microaggression. As we see, you know, we don't see this acknowledgement of being a person of color can come with its, you know, hardship because of this country and because of the systemic racism that has, you know, been in this country since the beginning. And you know, there's not really an acknowledgement of that sometimes among, you know, a group of white friends, or, you know, being interrupted or things like that, especially from the male perspective too. If we want to bring sexism into the mix, that perspective of, you know, I've been interrupted by males and white males, you know, so many times. I can't get my point across because they'll interrupt me, or they'll not even listen to me in the first place. So there have been many instances with people among my age group as well.
Yeah, I feel the same. And I've talked to many women of color who say this as well. And they bring, it's interesting that gender does come into this, because I feel women in general, you know, there's a power structure in our community and in our society, and that we are valued just a little less, right, based on what we get paid and our voice and all of those things. And so when we're in a room, like, I've observed this too. I'd love to actually code it and put it into a research paper, but looking at a group of men and one woman. Now, Nancy Pelosi doesn't count as this, but because she holds her own. But when you're looking at a whole bunch of men and a woman, you see the men looking at each other, sort of valuing each other, resonating the things that they're saying with each other, and you see the woman's trying to fight to get her word in and trying to. So I think I hear your microaggressions, very, you know, being interrupted, those kind of things. I think that resonates for me as well. You know, I think for me, and I think, you know, that I've experienced so many times in so many ways, but recently, as I was running the campaign, one of the things that I looked at was we had a team of people that knocked on doors before the pandemic. And we would go together. And when I had multiple people of color knocking doors versus having even one white person join us, I would look quickly at the rate of door opening on we have a little software where we can track that. So we found that if we had even one white person, the doors would open faster, or the rate of door would, not faster, the rate of door opening would go up. And so we course corrected really quickly and made this team of, you know, we had a white person and a person of color, and we did much better. And it was great because we could adapt, but it just, you know, we sat down one day and we were like, wow. And one of my campaign managers, Lena Kennedy, Lena put this together. She was like, we got to change. We got to adapt. Like, let's figure this out. And while it was powerful in so many ways for our team, because it really brought us together, like, white allies are powerful.
Yeah.
Right? It can change the fate of politics to have allies in the mix. So we were not taking away from any people of color, but just adding and making this rich, amazing team that we had. And we really did have a multi-racial, multi-religious, multi-everything team that worked on this. And we learned so much from each other and heard each other's stories. And it was powerful to be together for that long and see each other as doing this work all together. Absolutely. But things like, does your candidate speak the language? Does your candidate speak English? Does your candidate have citizenship. I was like, you can't run unless you have citizenship.
Yeah.
But okay. So just those kind of things that have been really powerful. And then of course I could write a volume on just governing as a person of color, but many of those things came into play too. So do you think that, we talked a little bit about this, do you think being a woman compounds racism, and at the same time the gender brings us together in ways? Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I feel like, to touch on the point of gender, there can be this sense of like unification, but at the same time, there's a divide in, like, if we look at white feminism, for instance, like all feminism should be intersectional, and when you look at white feminism, oftentimes it's white women not including people of color into the mix, women of color into the mix. And it's different because though, as women, just as women, if we don't look at race, just as women, we are told that we're too emotional if we get passionate, right? But then you bring in race and you bring in stereotypes with people of color. So, for women of color, it's twofold, because there's stereotypes like the angry Black woman, so, or the fiery Latina woman. And so there's this urge to just be quiet and not stand up for yourself and not demand basic respect.
Absolutely. And they're shy, the quiet Asian woman, right? Like,
Yes.
And why do you have to be all those? I mean, certainly I was, for a long time in my life, I was that, shy Asian woman. And at one point I was like, why am I silencing my own self?
Yeah.
Like, crazy. I need to speak. And then of course, like, unleashed a monster. But I want to go back to, just really quickly, to differentiate between my experience as a woman of color and a BIPOC's experience as a woman of color, and especially a Black person's experience in this country. And there is nothing that informs my experience in that way of 400 years of oppression,
Mm-hmm.
and the systemic racism and atrocities that have been committed against Black people in this country. And I cannot equate my experience to that. And I think when resources are spent to course correct for a group, that we need to focus on the injustices that have been put upon that community in the most atrocious and horrific ways. And that, so I didn't want to leave that our experience without that. And then, I think I'm going to ask you to, because you have a different identity than me. You have a BIPOC identity and an Indian identity. And I want you to talk a little bit about both of those, sort of differentiate between the racism within those.
Yeah, well, I'm glad that you brought this up, because I saw in the chat someone asking about racism within the Indian community. And, my dad's mulatto, so he's Afro-Latino. And there's so much that, again, me being my identity, I also can't speak on behalf of Black women. And there's so much oppression dating back hundreds of years, as you said. Even, if I look into my own family history, my great grandmother on, my dad's side, she was a Black woman. And, then in Brazil, white men would marry Black women and just treat them terribly. And that was just, common. And just trying to, like, seeing this generational trauma, and trying to fix it and pick up the pieces is just, it's a whole process in itself. And I think in order to address this in full, we need to give Black women, we need to give BIPOC, Indigenous women, we need to give BIPOC a platform. Again, if we want to go back to storytelling, we need to amplify these voices, because I think, in so many instances, it's still considered commonplace, for BIPOC to just be quiet and not have a voice, because of intergenerational trauma. So I think it's a matter of correcting that trauma. And, to touch on, I think we could both touch on this, because, the racism in the Indian community, we were discussing this earlier, it's so present in the Indian community. And it's so odd when I'm sitting with my family, you know, and they are saying something racist about Latinos. And I'm there like, I'm Latina, what are you doing? Like, and I have to say something. And it just shocks me because it's this sense of superiority, you know, oftentimes. There's often the sense of superiority. Like I'm the model minority, you know, even though the model minority is a myth, there's still that sense of, oh, you know, Latinos just don't come here legally and things like that, which, you know, oh, BIPOC is Black, Indigenous, and then other people of color. So it includes Black, Indigenous, Latinos, Latinx, Hispanic, yeah, so it's yeah, but it's definitely in the Indian community, there's so many things. Also, there's that, like we mentioned earlier, there's that need to assimilate. And I find it really interesting that you brought up the point that, you know, your family thought, you know, we have to get to the richest, whitest neighborhood. And I feel like that is so true, you know, for a lot of Indian communities. That's the first thing, you know. When I moved to Howard County, the first thing that I saw was there's like 4 Indian families on my block. And I was just like, yeah, that's what we've been told, is that that's what these older Indians and these older generations also have been told, which is that, oh, I need to get to a rich white neighborhood and I need to raise my kids there. So there's often just this correlation of success with white America. There's this correlation of Latinos with being, you know, not coming here legally, and then this sense in a lot of Indian people, which is, you know, why can't they come here legally? I did, you know. So that's where I associate that racism, and also the urge to just want to be white and assimilate to whiteness.
Yeah. And I think
this is really, really fascinating. I mean, I'd love to have this go on all night. We're at 7:55, and there was another question that was submitted to the Q&A. Love the discussion of white feminism, very topical now post Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And the question is for Uma. Do you resonate with the word feminism? Feel like a lot of younger women are rejecting the feminism?
Well, that's a great question. I do consider myself a feminist because when I think of feminist in my sense of definition, which I believe should be the sole definition, I think of intersectional. I think of all women of all different, you know, all different ethnicities, races. That's what I associate with feminism. I do understand, you know, my generation oftentimes, you know, not connecting with the term feminism because it won't include like non-binary people, people who don't identify as either gender, you know, which I also understand. But I think that feminism should be intersectional and include people who don't identify as male or female as well. And feminism can be for everyone, you know. Males should be feminist, you know. Feminism just means equality, and that's just something that I think that we need to emphasize. It doesn't mean women over men, it just means, you know, equal, and all of us should be equal, and people of color should get that should be, their voices should be elevated.
Agree. I agree totally with what you just said.
Me too, 100%. There's another question, Uma. Columbia prides itself on being a diverse, open community. Do you see it that way?
So that's a loaded question because on the one hand, I see it in, you know, some of my wonderful teachers, some of these wonderful community members, talks such as this. You know, I see, you know, this attempt at, you know, and just this intersectionality, which is wonderful. However, there can be a sense of, you know, some elitism which can tie hand in hand to racism. There's a sense of, you know, even if you look at, you know, I go to Hammond High School, which is a predominantly Black and brown school, and if you compare, you know, my school to other schools that are richer, whiter, we don't have the same resources. You know, in Columbia, in Howard County, you know, all schools are their top schools, but still, it's not a coincidence when there's a school like mine, which is predominantly Black and brown, and we don't have the same resources as a richer, whiter school. We see, you know, parents, we see oftentimes white parents, some Asian parents who have advocated for there not to be more integration. So there's also issues such as those which do need to be addressed. So I think that there's still a long way to go.
Should we close? Can we do our last?
I think we could go on all night, and I think we'd all love to, but we do have a time sensitive, a time commitment, and I do want to thank you, Sabina and Uma, for this really engaging and inspirational and aspirational conversation this evening, and for being part of Community Rising, Residences at Vantage Point's Arts and Culture Collective in celebration of our 30th anniversary. I want to remind our guests and the audience that we will have all 3 of the programs in this series posted to our website, vantagepointresidences.org. We already have the first one of the series, but probably in a couple of days we will have all 3 so that those who weren't able to attend can see it, or if you wanted to go back and revisit some of the guests' answers and commentary, please, we welcome you to do that. And Sabina, Uma, very, very gracious of you to join us this evening, and we really appreciate your insight and your comments tonight.
Thank you so much. Thanks for giving, you know, us this platform.
Yes. Thank you, Uma, for a great conversation earlier and right now.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for helping me guide this. And thank you to everybody who asked questions.
Yes.
Great. Thank you again from Residences at Vantage Point. We very much appreciate it. Thank you, everyone who was able to join us. Have a wonderful evening.
Good night.